The Dungeons and Dragons, Saturday morning cartoon, a complete deep dive. Welcome. Now, before we talk about magic arrows, disappearing cloaks, or five-headed dragons, we need to talk about one of the most beloved and controversial animated series of the 1980s, a show that introduced an entire generation to the concepts of Dungeons and Dragons that dared to be darker and more emotionally complex than typical Saturday morning fare, and that ended with one of television's most infamous never-aired finales. If you grew up in the 80s, you probably remember the opening theme, that haunting roller coaster ride, and six kids who just wanted to go home, but kept getting pulled into one adventure after another. This is the complete story of the Dungeons and Dragons animated series. Whether you're here to relive childhood memories or to learn about a piece of gaming history, settle in. We're covering everything: the characters, the villains, the controversies, the production drama, and yes, that finale that was written but never produced. Let's begin. The premise and the ride.
Hey, look! The Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening?
Oh!
Where are we? Look out!
Fear not, Ranger. Barbarian, magician, thief, cavalier, and acrobat.
Who was that?
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
The Dungeons and Dragons cartoon premiered on CBS on September the 17th, 1983, and it started with one of the most memorable opening sequences in Saturday morning television history. Six kids, ranging in age from 8 to 15, decide to take a ride on a Dungeons and Dragons-themed roller coaster at an amusement park. The ride starts normally enough, but then reality warps. The coaster plunges through a magical portal, and suddenly these kids find themselves transported to an entirely different world. Not a dream, not a game. An actual fantasy realm filled with magic, monsters, and danger. This premise was darker than people realized at the time. These weren't kids playing pretend. These weren't heroes who chose adventure. These were children who were essentially kidnapped from their world and trapped in another, desperately trying to find a way home while surviving in a realm that could kill them at any moment. That undercurrent of displacement and loss ran through every episode. Even when the show tried to be lighthearted, these kids wanted to go home. They missed their families. And every episode that didn't end with them finding a portal back was another reminder that they were stuck. When they arrive in this realm, the first person they meet is the Dungeon Master, a mysterious figure who gives each of them a magical item corresponding to a character class from the Dungeons and Dragons game. The Dungeon Master is small, almost dwarf-like, bald with wispy hair, wearing red robes and speaking entirely in cryptic riddles and vague guidance. He's named after the role of the game master in D&D, the person who runs the game and controls the world. And true to that role, the Dungeon Master seems to know everything that's happening, can appear and disappear at will, and always shows up at exactly the right moment to offer just enough help to keep the kids alive without actually solving their problems for them. The six heroes and their magical items. Let's talk about our protagonists. because each of them brought something unique to the party. First, there's Hank, the oldest of the group. With his distinctive blonde surfer hair, Hank becomes the ranger, and the dungeon master gives him an energy bow. This magical bow doesn't fire normal arrows. Instead, it shoots arrows of pure energy that can do various things depending on what the situation requires. They can explode to frighten enemies, wrap around opponents to tie them up, create bridges of light, or just blast through obstacles. Importantly, and this will matter when we talk about the controversies, Hank's bow almost never directly harms anyone. The arrows are tools and restraints, not weapons of violence. Hank is the de facto leader of the group, which is a burden he struggles with throughout the series. He makes mistakes. He doubts himself. He nearly breaks under the pressure in episodes like The Dragon's Graveyard, but he keeps trying because someone has to hold this group together. Then there's Eric, who becomes the Cavalier. Eric is voiced by Don Most, who you might recognize as Ralph Malph from Happy Days. Eric is the comic relief and also the most realistic character in some ways. He's a coward. He complains constantly. He wants to go home more than any of them. He questions why they keep risking their lives for strangers. And honestly, he's not wrong. Eric gets the shield of protection, a magical shield that can grow to enormous size to protect the entire group, deflect attacks, and even allow him to float through the air by riding on it. Eric is deeply insecure about his cowardice, which makes sense because he's just a teenager thrust into life or death situations. But time and again, when it really matters, Eric comes through. His character arc across the series is subtle but real. Diana is the acrobat, and she's the physical powerhouse of the group, despite being one of the girls. She's athletic, brave, and kind-hearted. Her weapon is a javelin that can extend to incredible lengths, shrink back down, and is apparently indestructible. She uses it for pole vaulting as a bridge to trip enemies, or occasionally as an actual weapon. Diana was voiced by Tanya Gale Smith, who was nominated for Outstanding Young Actress in an animation voiceover for her work. Diana often serves as the emotional core of the group, the one who believes in doing the right thing and helping people in need. Presto is Albert, a nerdy kid who becomes the magician. He changes his name from Albert to Presto, probably because Presto the Magician sounds a lot cooler than Albert the Magician. His magical item is a hat that produces random objects when he reaches into it. The running gag with Presto is that the hat almost never produces what he actually wants. He'll reach in, hoping for a weapon, and pull out a rubber duck. He'll need a rope and get a plate of spaghetti. But somehow, through clever thinking or pure luck, whatever the hat produces ends up being exactly what they needed, just not in the way anyone expected. It's a great metaphor for the unpredictability of magic and D&D, and it gave the writers room for both comedy and creative problem-solving. Sheila is the thief, the quietest and most sensitive member of the group. Her magical item is a cloak of invisibility, which does exactly what it sounds like. When she pulls the hood up, she becomes completely invisible. This makes her invaluable for reconnaissance and stealth missions, but it also plays into her character's tendency to want to hide, to avoid conflict, to disappear when things get scary. Throughout the series, Sheila grows more confident and learns when to be seen versus when to hide. And finally, there's Bobby, Sheila's little brother. Bobby's only 8 years old, the youngest of the group by far, and he becomes the barbarian he's given a thunder club, a magical weapon that can cause earthquakes when struck against the ground, create sonic booms, or just be used as an intimidating big stick. The irony of the smallest youngest kid being the barbarian wasn't lost on anyone. But Bobby is fearless in the way only children can be, charging into danger without fully understanding it. And his optimism often lifts the others' spirits when they're losing hope. There's also Uni, a baby unicorn who becomes the group's pet and companion. Uni was voiced by Frank Welker, the legendary voice actor who did Megatron in Transformers, Fred and Scooby-Doo, and countless other characters. Uni can teleport short distances, though this ability is inconsistent and seems to come and go depending on what the plot requires. Uni is essentially comic relief and cute factor, but also represents innocence and the good that exists in this dangerous realm. The Dungeon Master's cryptic wisdom. Now let's talk about one of the most memorable aspects of this show, the Dungeon Master himself. This mysterious figure appears in nearly every episode, always at crucial moments, always speaking in riddles and vague prophecies that only make sense after the fact. The Dungeon Master never directly helps the kids solve their problems. Instead, he poses questions, offers cryptic clues, and then disappears, leaving them to figure things out on their own. There's actually a philosophy behind this. In the tabletop game, a dungeon master's job isn't to solve problems for the players. It's to present challenges and let the players find their own solutions. The animated dungeon master embodies this perfectly. He'll say things like, "The answer you seek lies in the question you fear to ask," or, "To find your way home, you must first lose your way." Infuriating, right? But that's the point. The kids have to learn, grow, and solve problems themselves. The Dungeon Master is their guide, not their savior. This approach frustrated some viewers, especially kids who just wanted someone to help these poor children get home. But it created an interesting dynamic. The Dungeon Master clearly cared about the kids. He kept them safe as much as he could. But he also had his own agenda, his own reasons for bringing them to this realm and keeping them there, reasons that wouldn't be revealed until the unproduced finale. Venger, the force of evil. Every good hero needs a great villain, and the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon delivered one of the most memorable antagonists of 80s animation, Venger. Venger is described as the force of evil, a powerful sorcerer who rules through fear and dark magic. He's visually striking, appearing as a demonic figure with horns, bat-like wings, and wearing flowing black and red robes. His most distinctive feature is his ram-like horns and his single glowing eye visible beneath his hood. Venger was voiced by Peter Cullen, who simultaneously was voicing Optimus Prime in Transformers. So you had the voice of one of the greatest heroes of the 80s, playing one of the era's most memorable villains. And Cullen brought real menace to the role. Venger wasn't a joke villain. He was genuinely threatening, capable of devastating magic, and absolutely ruthless in his pursuit of the children's magical weapons. That's Venger's primary motivation throughout the series. He wants the kids' weapons. He believes that if he can claim all 6 magical items for himself, he'll become unstoppable, powerful enough to rule the entire realm, and possibly destroy the Dungeon Master himself. Every episode involves Venger either directly attacking the kids or manipulating events to separate them from their weapons, or turn them against each other. But Venger is more than just a power-hungry villain. As the series progresses, we get hints of depth. He's in conflict with Tiamat, the 5-headed dragon goddess who is even more powerful than he is. He has a complicated relationship with the Dungeon Master that goes beyond simple good versus evil. And in the unproduced finale, we would have learned the truth. Venger is the Dungeon Master's son, Their conflict is familial, a father trying to redeem a son who has chosen evil. This revelation recontextualizes everything we saw in the series. Tiamat and the Rogues Gallery. Beyond Venger, the show featured an impressive rogues gallery of monsters and villains drawn from D&D lore. The most memorable of these is Tiamat, the five-headed dragon in D&D mythology. Tiamat is a goddess of evil dragons, and the show depicts her as terrifyingly powerful. Each of her 5 heads breathes a different type of elemental attack: fire, ice, lightning, acid, and poison. She's so powerful that even Venger fears her. In fact, one of Venger's recurring threats is that if the kids don't cooperate with him, he'll feed them to Tiamat. Several episodes feature Tiamat as a nearly unstoppable force of destruction that both the heroes and Venger have to avoid or flee from. The show also featured various other D&D monsters and characters. Warduke, a suit of animated evil armor, appeared in one episode and was also part of the LJN toy line, released alongside the show. Kellic, an evil wizard, served as a recurring antagonist. There were episodes featuring beholders, those iconic floating spheres covered in eyes. Shadow demons served as Venger's scouts and spies. The show pulled from the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, introducing kids to creatures like bullywugs, orcs, trolls, and countless others. What's interesting is that the show was educational in a way. Kids who watched this cartoon learned D&D terminology and concepts. They learned what a ranger does versus a cavalier. They learned about character classes, magical items, alignment between good and evil, and the basic structure of fantasy adventures. For many viewers, this cartoon was their first exposure to role-playing game concepts, and it absolutely contributed to D&D's mainstream popularity in the 80s. The dark premise nobody talks about. Here's something that's often overlooked when discussing this show. The premise is actually horrifying if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. 6 children are magically kidnapped from Earth and trapped in a fantasy dimension where they're constantly in danger of being killed by monsters, evil wizards, or any number of other threats. They can't contact their families. Their parents have no idea where they are. From Earth's perspective, these kids probably vanished mysteriously from an amusement park ride and were never seen again. Their families are likely devastated, and the kids know this. There are episodes where they talk about missing their families, about wanting to go home, about the lives they left behind. The show plays with this emotional weight in surprisingly mature ways for a Saturday morning cartoon. In several episodes, the kids are offered a chance to go home, but they have to sacrifice something or someone to do it. Do they abandon an innocent person to save themselves? Do they doom the realm to return to Earth? These aren't easy questions, and the show didn't always provide easy answers. The episode The Box is particularly brutal in this regard. The kids make it home. They're actually back on Earth, but Venger follows them through the portal, and they realize he'll destroy their world if they don't stop him. So they voluntarily return to the realm, giving up their one chance to go home because they can't let an entire world be destroyed. It's a devastating choice, and the episode doesn't sugarcoat it. They're stuck, and they chose to be stuck. Because staying was the right thing to do, even if it meant sacrificing their own happiness. This dark undercurrent runs through the entire series, even in lighter episodes. These kids are trapped, and despite the Dungeon Master's vague promises about finding a way home, there's no guarantee they ever will. The show was essentially about children learning to survive and find meaning in impossible circumstances, which is surprisingly heavy for a cartoon about Dungeons and Dragons. The infamous unproduced finale, Requiem. Now we come to one of the most famous unproduced episodes in television history. The Dungeons & Dragons cartoon ran for 3 seasons, totaling 27 episodes. Season 1 had 13 episodes, Season 2 had 8, and Season 3 had only 6. There was supposed to be a 7th episode in Season 3, a series finale titled Requiem, but it was never produced. The script for Requiem was written by Michael Reeves, one of the show's primary writers. After the show was canceled, Reeves kept the script, and years later he released it online for fans to read later. For the BCI Eclipse DVD release of the series, Requiem was performed as a radio drama, with the original cast returning to voice their characters, giving fans a chance to finally experience the ending that was denied to them. So what happens in Requiem? The episode would have revealed several major truths about the series. First, and most importantly, it reveals that Venger is the Dungeon Master's son. The Dungeon Master brought the 6 kids to the realm specifically to help redeem Venger, to give him a chance at salvation. The entire series was essentially an elaborate plan by the Dungeon Master to save his son's soul. The episode involves a quest where the kids must retrieve a magical key. Throughout their journey, they're tested by both the Dungeon Master and Venger, each trying to pull them in different directions. The kids are faced with their ultimate moral choice. Do they trust the Dungeon Master, who has guided them but also kept them trapped in this world? Or do they trust Venger's promises of power and an easy way home? In the end, the kids pass the test. Venger is offered redemption and a chance to give up his evil ways. The implication is that if he accepts, the kids can finally go home. The episode was meant to serve as both a conclusion to the series and a potential jumping-off point for a 4th season with a new status quo. If the show had been renewed, Season 4 would have focused less on violence and weapons and more on the kids using intelligence and self-reliance to solve problems, with a redeemed Venger possibly becoming an ally rather than an enemy. But none of this was produced. The show was canceled before Requiem could be animated, leaving fans with an unresolved cliffhanger for decades. The script's release and the radio play gave some closure, but it's not the same as seeing it brought to life with animation. To this day, Requiem remains one of the most famous unmade episodes in animation history, a what might have been that fans still discuss and debate. The controversy and the Satanic Panic. You can't talk about the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon without addressing the controversy that surrounded it, because this show launched right into the middle of what's now called the Satanic Panic of the 80s. During this era, Dungeons & Dragons, the game, was being accused by certain religious groups of promoting witchcraft, Satanism, and violence. There were claims that the game caused psychological damage, that it led to suicide and murder, that it was a gateway to occult practices. These accusations were based on misunderstandings, isolated incidents that were wrongly attributed to the game, and general moral panic about anything involving fantasy and magic. The cartoon became caught up in this controversy. The National Coalition on Television Violence claimed that Dungeons & Dragons was the most violent show on network television, which is frankly absurd when you actually watch it. The show went out of its way to avoid depicting actual violence. Hank's arrows never pierced anyone. Bobby's club created earthquakes but never crushed anyone. The weapons were tools that frightened or restrained enemies but rarely harmed them. When the kids faced monsters that needed to be defeated, those monsters were almost always creatures that couldn't truly die like golems and animated skeletons or beings like Tiamat who were immortal anyway. But that didn't matter to the critics. In 1985, the National Coalition on Television Violence demanded that the FTC require a warning to be broadcast before each episode, stating that Dungeons and Dragons has been linked to real-life violent deaths. This was based on incidents where troubled teenagers who happened to play D&D had committed suicide or violence, and anti-game activists blamed the game rather than underlying mental health issues or other factors. These claims have since been thoroughly debunked. But at the time, they created real pressure on the show. One specific episode became a flashpoint for controversy: the Dragon's Graveyard. In this episode, the kids actually have an opportunity to permanently kill Venger. They're in a location where even powerful beings can die permanently, and they seriously contemplate murdering their enemy to end the threat he poses. They debate the morality of it. This was almost unprecedented for a children's cartoon at the time. The script was nearly canceled because executives were afraid of the backlash from parent groups. The episode did air, but it highlighted how the show was trying to grapple with complex moral questions that made some people very uncomfortable. The controversy definitely hurt the show's viewership and contributed to its cancellation. But it also makes the show more interesting in retrospect. This was a cartoon willing to ask hard questions, to portray children in genuine danger and moral quandaries, to not talk down to its audience. That's part of why it remains memorable decades later. How the show introduced D&D to a generation. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon was hugely successful at its primary goal: introducing D&D concepts to a mainstream audience. Before this show, Dungeons and Dragons was a niche hobby, known primarily to game enthusiasts. The cartoon changed that. Suddenly, millions of children were being exposed to terms like ranger, cavalier, thief, later changed to rogue in the game, character classes, magical items, monsters like beholders and displacer beasts, and the basic structure of fantasy adventuring. The show led its time slot for 2 years, meaning it was the most watched cartoon in its Saturday morning slot. It spawned over 100 different licensing deals for merchandise. While the main characters famously didn't get action figures at the time, we'll get to that in a moment, there were books, comics, and other products. The show's success directly contributed to D&D's explosive mainstream popularity in the mid-'80s. For many people who later became serious D&D players, this cartoon was their first exposure to the game. They watched Hank use his ranger abilities, saw Presto cast spells from his magical hat, watched Diana's acrobatic combat, and thought, I want to do that. The show was essentially a weekly advertisement for the tabletop game, demonstrating how adventures worked and making the concept accessible to kids who might have found the actual rule books intimidating. The show also helped normalize fantasy gaming at a time when it was under attack. By putting a friendly, heroic face on D&D by showing kids using teamwork and moral reasoning to solve problems, the cartoon countered some of the negative stereotypes about the game. It didn't eliminate the controversy, but it did help many parents see that D&D content could be wholesome family entertainment rather than satanic corruption. The strange case of the missing toys. Here's a weird footnote in the show's history. There was an official Dungeons and Dragons toy line produced by LJN in 1983, timed to coincide with the cartoon's launch. But bizarrely, none of the main characters from the show were included in the toy line. Not Hank, not Eric, not Diana, Presto, Sheila, Bobby, or even Uni. You couldn't buy action figures of the cartoon's protagonists. Instead, the toy line featured original characters like Warduke, Strongheart the Paladin, Kelek the Evil Wizard, and various monsters. Some of these characters were then worked into individual episodes of the show, like Kelek appeared in one episode and Warduke in another, but they weren't main characters. The toy line existed parallel to the show rather than being directly based on it. Why did this happen? Apparently, there were licensing complications and decisions made at the corporate level that resulted in the toy line being developed separately from the show. It's a fascinating case of a cartoon that was hugely popular, but couldn't capitalize on merchandising in the most obvious way. This bizarre situation wasn't corrected for 40 years. Only in Spain and Portugal were PVC figures of the main cast produced during the show's original run. It wasn't until 2022 and 2023 that Hasbro finally released official action figures of Hank, Eric, Diana, Presto, Sheila, and Bobby as part of their retro cartoon Classics line. 4 decades after the show premiered, you could finally buy toys of the actual main characters. Behind the scenes and production. The Dungeons & Dragons cartoon was a co-production between several companies, which created both opportunities and complications. Marvel Productions handled the American side of production and writing TSR, the company that created Dungeons & Dragons, held the rights and had creative input. And Toei Animation, the legendary Japanese studio that also worked on shows like Dragon Ball Z, Voltron, and various other anime and American cartoons, handled the actual animation. Gary Gygax, one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons, served as a consultant and co-producer on the show. This gave it a level of authenticity to the game's lore that might have been missing otherwise. The writing staff included Jeffrey Scott, who wrote many episodes from the first season and also worked on shows like DuckTales and Captain N. The game master Michael Reeves, who wrote the unproduced finale, was a prolific animation writer who worked on everything from Gargoyles to Batman, the animated series. The voice cast was stellar. Beyond Peter Cullen as Venger and Frank Welker as Uni and various monsters, you had Willie Ames from Charles in Charge voicing Hank, Don Most from Happy Days voicing Eric, and a group of talented young actors voicing the kids. The cast had good chemistry, and their performances elevated material that could have been one-dimensional into something with real emotional depth. The show's theme music, composed by Johnny Douglas, became iconic. That opening with the roller coaster and the dramatic orchestral theme is instantly recognizable to anyone who watched the show. Years later, a full orchestral version was released on an album in 1991, showing the lasting appeal of the music. The adult heroes. Where are they now? Now here's where things get really interesting. For decades, fans wondered what happened to those 6 kids after the cartoon ended. Did they ever make it home? Did they grow up in the realm? Did they become the legendary heroes the Dungeon Master seemed to think they could be? And for the longest time, there were no official answers, just speculation and fan theories. But that changed in 2024 and 2025 when Wizards of the Coast decided to bring the characters back as part of official Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition content. And the answer they gave us was both satisfying and bittersweet. The kids didn't go home. They grew up in the realm. They became adults there, seasoned adventurers who've been fighting for good for years. They're still together, still a team, still carrying those magical weapons the Dungeon Master gave them so long ago. The official adventures featuring the adult versions of these characters are set in the Forgotten Realms, which is the default setting for modern D&D. For those unfamiliar, the Forgotten Realms is a massive fantasy world with its own continents, kingdoms, gods, and history. It's where other famous D&D characters like Drizzt Do'Urden and Elminster exist. And now, canonically, Hank, Eric, Diana, Presto, Sheila, and Bobby are part of that world too. They're fourth-level characters in the official stat blocks, which in D&D terms means they're experienced, but not yet legendary. They're competent heroes who've survived years of adventuring and learned their crafts, but they're not world-shaking archmages or god-level warriors. They're still, fundamentally, those same 6 people we knew from the cartoon, just older and wiser. Let's talk about who they become. Hank is still the leader, still wielding that energy bow. He's grown into his role as a ranger, no longer the uncertain teenager questioning every decision. He's confident, tactical, and has developed the wilderness survival skills and tracking abilities that rangers are known for. The boy who worried about leading his friends has become a man who knows how to guide them through danger. He's learned to trust his instincts, to make the hard calls when necessary, and to accept that leadership means sometimes being wrong, but always trying your best. His energy bow has remained his signature weapon, and he's mastered its use to the point where he can pull off shots that seem impossible. Eric is perhaps the most interesting case because he's still a cavalier, still carrying that shield of protection, but he's no longer the coward he thought he was. Adult Eric has accepted something about himself. Being afraid doesn't make you a coward if you act anyway. He's learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being terrified. He's become the party's defender, the one who stands between his friends and danger, using that shield to protect them just like he always did. But now he does it with purpose and acceptance rather than reluctance. He still complains, because that's who Eric is, but there's an undercurrent of dry humor to it now rather than genuine panic. He's made peace with being the guy who's scared but shows up anyway. Diana has grown into a formidable warrior. Her acrobat abilities have been honed over years of combat and exploration. She can move through a battlefield like water, vaulting over enemies, using her staff to redirect attacks, striking from unexpected angles. She's become the party's scout and the one who takes point in dangerous situations because she has the mobility to retreat if things go wrong. Her kindness hasn't diminished, that core of compassion that always defined her. If anything, years of seeing what evil can do have made her more determined to help people, to leave places better than she found them. She's the moral compass of the group in many ways, the one who reminds them why they fight when the battles seem endless. Presto has become a true wizard, not just a kid with a magical hat. He's studied magic properly, learned spells beyond what the hat can randomly produce, developed the scholarly knowledge that separates a novice from a master. But he still has that hat, and it still produces unexpected things at unexpected times. The difference is that adult Presto has learned to work with the chaos rather than against it. He's developed a philosophy that magic is as much about improvisation and creative problem-solving as it is about memorized formulas. His spellcasting combines formal wizardry with the unpredictable nature of his hat, making him versatile in ways that more rigid wizards aren't. He's probably the one who's changed the most intellectually, having devoted himself to understanding magic in all its forms. Sheila has come out of her shell, quite literally. She still has the cloak of invisibility, still uses stealth and reconnaissance as her primary contributions, but she's no longer hiding from her own life. She's learned when to be seen and when to disappear, when to speak up and when to observe quietly her skills as a thief. And thieves in modern D&D are called rogues, have expanded beyond simple invisibility. She's a skilled infiltrator, a capable combatant with her short swords, and someone who can gather information in ways that benefit the entire party. The shy girl who wanted to disappear has become a confident woman who chooses when to be visible. It's a subtle but important distinction. Bobby, the youngest when this all started, is now a young man but still the barbarian, still wielding that thunder club. He's grown physically. No longer the small child with a weapon too big for him. He's strong, capable, and has developed a warrior's instincts. But he's kept that core of optimism that defined him as a kid. He still believes in doing the right thing. He still charges into danger to protect the people he cares about. He still trusts that his friends will have his back and that good will triumph if they just keep fighting. In a party of people who've been worn down by years of adventuring, Bobby is the one who keeps their spirits up, who reminds them that they're making a difference. The official adventures featuring these characters, Uni and the Hunt for the Lost Horn and others, are designed to be played by modern D&D groups. You can create your own characters and adventure alongside the adult versions of these cartoon heroes. Or you can play as them using their official character sheets. It's a way for a new generation to interact with these iconic characters, and for people who grew up with the show to revisit them as peers rather than watching children on screen. The adventures are written with respect for the source material while fitting into the Forgotten Realms continuity. What's not explicitly stated, but what we can infer from these official materials, is that these six never made it home. That portal they were always searching for, that way back to Earth and their families, it never appeared. Or maybe it did appear and they chose not to take it, because by that point the realm was their home, and each other was their family. The show's unproduced finale hinted at choices like that, and perhaps in the official continuity, they made a similar choice. They grew up here, they built lives here, and they've spent years, probably decades at this point, adventuring through the Forgotten Realms, helping people, fighting evil, being the heroes the Dungeon Master always knew they could become. There's something bittersweet about this. On one hand, it's wonderful to know that they survived, that they thrived, that they're still together and still fighting the good fight. They didn't fragment and go their separate ways. They remained a team, a family. On the other hand, it means those families back on Earth never got their children back. Those parents who watched their kids vanish into a roller coaster never learned what happened. There's a tragedy in that, a permanent separation that can't be undone. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the story of the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon was always about finding home in unexpected places, about making family with the people who stand beside you in the darkness, about growing up when you're forced to rather than when you're ready. The fact that official D&D has brought these characters into the Forgotten Realms as adults, has given them stats and abilities and continuing stories, means that their adventure didn't end in 1985. It continued. It's still continuing. Somewhere in the Forgotten Realms right now, Hank is drawing his energy bow. Eric is raising his shield to protect his friends while complaining about it. Diana is vaulting over an enemy's head. Presto is pulling something completely unexpected from his hat. Sheila is scouting ahead while invisible. And Bobby is charging into battle with his thunder club held high. They're not kids anymore. They're heroes. The heroes they were always meant to be. The legacy and modern revival. The Dungeons and Dragons cartoon ended in 1985, but its influence didn't end there. For decades, it remained a cult favorite, passed down through recorded VHS tapes, later released on DVD, and eventually found by new generations on streaming services, the show's reputation grew over time as people reassessed it with adult eyes and realized how sophisticated it was for a Saturday morning cartoon. In 2009, IGN ranked Dungeons and Dragons at number 64 on its list of the best 100 animated series ever, a respectable placement for a show that only ran for 27 episodes. Fans created websites dedicated to it, wrote analysis of episodes, and kept the memory alive online. Then, in recent years, there's been a full-fledged revival of interest. In 2023, IDW Publishing launched Dungeons and Dragons Saturday Morning Adventures, a comic book miniseries written by David M. Boer and Sam Maggs, with art by George Cambadais. The series continues the adventures of the 6 kids as they once again face Venger in what's described as lost episodes of the original show. The comic has been successful enough to continue beyond its initial miniseries. In 2024 and 2025, the characters from the cartoon have appeared in official D&D adventures available through D&D Beyond, including Uni and the Hunt for the Lost Horn and Scions of Elemental Evil. These adventures are designed for modern D&D 5th edition play, allowing today's players to interact with the iconic characters from the show. The kids are now adults in these adventures, having grown up and become more experienced adventurers, with character sheets provided at level 4. Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast have fully embraced the cartoon as part of D&D's official history. The characters have appeared in official sourcebooks. There have been multiple toy lines released, and even a Little Golden Book adaptation of the first episode was published in 2023, introducing new generations of children to the story. There's talk of potential new animated adaptations, though nothing has been officially confirmed. The success of recent animated fantasy series and the nostalgic appeal of 80s properties make it plausible that we could see a reboot or continuation someday. Closing thoughts. The Dungeons and Dragons Saturday morning cartoon was more than just a toy commercial or a simple adventure show. It was a surprisingly sophisticated series that introduced complex moral questions, dealt with themes of displacement and loss, and trusted its young audience to handle ambiguity and difficult choices. It featured memorable characters, iconic villains, and a premise that was darker and more interesting than it first appeared. The show's willingness to grapple with violence, mortality, and ethical dilemmas made it controversial at the time, but also makes it more interesting to revisit today. It was a cartoon that asked whether kids should kill their enemy given the chance, whether going home was worth sacrificing innocence, and how to maintain hope when trapped in impossible circumstances. These aren't typical Saturday morning themes. The unproduced finale, Requiem, remains one of animation's great what-might-have-beens, a script that promised to answer questions and provide closure that the cancellation denied viewers for decades. The revelation that Venger was Dungeon Master's son recontextualizes the entire series, turning what seemed like a simple good versus evil story into a family tragedy about a father trying to save his child's soul. For a generation of viewers, this cartoon was their first exposure to Dungeons and Dragons and to fantasy gaming in general. It sparked imaginations, taught game concepts, and inspired countless kids to pick up dice and rule books and start their own adventures. That legacy alone makes it significant in gaming history. Whether you watched it as a kid Saturday mornings while eating cereal, whether you discovered it later through reruns or DVD releases, or whether you're just learning about it now, the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon is worth remembering. It was flawed, sometimes cheesy, very much a product of its era, but also, surprisingly, ambitious and emotionally resonant. It took risks that other shows wouldn't, tackled themes that went beyond simple entertainment, and created something that has endured for over 40 years. So here's to Hank and his energy bow, to Eric and his complaints, to Diana's bravery, Presto's accidental magic, Sheila's growing confidence, Bobby's fearless optimism, and Uni's adorable teleportation. Here's to the Dungeon Master's cryptic wisdom, to Venger's menace, and to Tiamat's 5 heads of destruction. Here's to 6 kids on a roller coaster who got more than they bargained for, who were trapped in another world and made the best of it, who faced impossible odds and kept trying because that's what heroes do. The ride may have ended in 1985, but the adventure continues in comics, in new official content, in the memories of fans, and in the influence it had on both animation and gaming culture. That's a legacy worth celebrating. Thank you for taking this journey through one of the 80s most memorable cartoons. Whether this brought back memories or taught you something new, whether you're going to track down episodes to watch or you're drifting off to sleep to the sound of fantasy lore, I hope this deep dive gave you everything you wanted to know about the Dungeons and Dragons Saturday morning cartoon. The portal is still open, the realm is still there, and somewhere the Dungeon Master is waiting with cryptic advice and another impossible quest.